Hey, Josh from church.tech. Thanks for being here. I've gotten to use your product a little bit and hang out with your team some. I know part of your team is here in Louisville, so it's been fun to get to know you guys and to talk through the future of what's coming and get to play around with your tool. Tell me just what you're working on and how did you end up in the AI space? What brought you to this kind of collision of faith and AI that's happening for the first time?
Yeah, absolutely. So we build AI tools for churches to help them make more disciples by spending less time with technology. Actually, ironically, our name is church.tech, and we're like, hey, we want you to spend less time with tech and more time with people. And we think AI can really facilitate that in some beautiful ways. And I got into this honestly. It's kind of a weird story because I was a pastor for 15 years, planted a church in Annapolis, Maryland, was leading that, really working towards some solutions for how our church could serve our community more effectively. Realized that technology needed to play a kind of central role in that. And so stepped into what I do now, which is build tech products that really help the church be the church. And we were building AI into the original company that we started and kind of realized, oh man, we could make some tools that probably have a simpler roadmap and a quicker roadmap to get up and running that would serve the church really, really effectively. And so our first product was we can take a sermon that's uploaded to our platform and turn it into the best small group leader discussion guide that your small group leaders have ever seen. And so that was kind of first thing we built, sent it out to some friends who were all lead pastors. They all kind of, freaked out about it. We're like, this is really good.
Yeah.
Asked for some changes. We made some of those. And then they were like, hey, can we tell our friends about this? And like, yeah. So that's kind of how we got into building church.tech.
Awesome. What's been your experience kind of going from that first MVP to where you're at now? Like has building on top of the AI tools that are available been more challenging than you expected, or does it kind of blow you away every day? Like what's possible and how rapidly things are changing? Like what does that look like since your genesis?
Yeah. I mean, I think the answer is yes, probably a little bit like, yes, we've been floored by, I mean, it changes every week. Like every single week, there is something new, some new development. And so we're constantly thinking about what could we do now? And
Yeah.
which is so much fun. Like that is like my, whole personality is like vision forward. My wife jokes 10 years in the future and I'm constantly like, come on, everybody, get out here. But and then figuring out how to use them, how to use the tools well, and how to implement them in a system that is really user friendly for pastors and church staff members and that type of thing. I think is the thing that uh, I wouldn't say we're frustrated with it so much as like we're just trying to do a really excellent job of that and to build a cohesive product that really does address a lot of the ways that AI um, can truly benefit the church. So
Yeah.
yeah, we're loving
Now
it.
that you've been into this for a while, I think once you get, into a product launch and you've got users and that kind of thing, you start to probably hear some of the same feedback, questions, comments, celebrations. What are some of the main things that you're hearing from people over and over? What's the kind of couple phrases that are like, oh yeah, I hear that every day now.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, um, on the negative side, it's like my sermon's not processing. Like we hear that, right now we're uploading about 50 sermons a day, and so across our user base, and so inevitably one or two people will be like, "Hey, there's something wrong. It didn't," which is standard tech company stuff. But man, it drives you crazy because you're just like, I just want it to
Yeah.
work for everyone perfectly. So we're working on that. On the celebration side of things, the I mean, almost every day I have a Zoom meeting with either a new customer, an existing customer, and sometimes that's to fix a problem or something like that. Sometimes it's just to like hear from our customer base, because we're trying to stay as close as we possibly can to really make sure that we're building in a way that makes sense to everybody. And yeah, like yesterday, I met with a guy who is the head of a comms department for a very large church. And he was just like, and I don't know if you all hear this enough, but like what you're building is beautiful. And like, if you can keep building on some of the comms tools, we will keep buying them. And man, we just like, our team just loves this. It makes so much sense to us. And it's helping us, like, truly, it's helping us save time. And that's the thing that, like, our whole value prop is we want to save you time. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a common story from comms teams specifically, who are always overtaxed and under-resourced.
Yeah.
And I'm sure this is a very relevant tool to them. So tell me, kind of, you must get pushback sometimes if you go to conferences, and maybe you're getting people reaching out to your company, and maybe even peers, like whoever it is. I'm sure you get the doubters. I'm sure you get the people who look at AI as a big scary thing that they don't understand. What do you say to kind of those who are like, should AI be involved in my sermon or in my content? Should it be anywhere near my church? What would you say to the pushback? And then what would you say is like the main reason that people should be going down the AI path?
Yeah, we get a lot of pushback. We run Facebook ads and stuff. And so if you go to our Facebook ads, you will see a lot of people expressing their opinions about AI. Most of them haven't even read the ad, which is funny to me. And like, I mean, I just sort of feel like, I don't know if you know this, but by commenting, you're actually helping this ad reach more people, which is like kind of a weird irony of like, you're trying to hate on this and you're actually helping us get in front of more people, because engagement is what like Facebook looks at to be like, oh yeah, we can send this out to a few thousand more people. But
Yeah.
And the reason I kind of think that's funny is most of the time it's like this assumption that AI is writing the sermon for the pastor entirely, and that's all that we're doing. And when we first started out, our name was sermons.tech, so I understand where people would assume that based on the name and everything. But that's the feedback that we get typically is like mostly about like pastors shouldn't be lazy, they shouldn't let AI just write a sermon for them. The more kind of drilled down people who have actually played with some of the tools and stuff and understand a little bit more, that feedback tends to be like, what about privacy? And what about, the ethics of using this to create tools that like engage with church members or potential church members and speak on behalf of our church, or, perceivably, because our church is supposed to be speaking for Jesus and putting out there who Jesus is for people as an example. Like now we're in an ethical dilemma. What do you do with that? That's really kind of the main pushback and question we get. Our kind of product at this point is really squarely angled at discipleship. How do we take existing content from from a sermon and create derivative content from that sermon? And so once they see what we built, most of them are like, oh, this is amazing. Like, I couldn't summarize that sermon that well. I'm like, yeah, because you can't hold every word in a sermon in tension in your mind all at the same time and think about how the best way to summarize all of these words is. But AI can, and mind is, I use that very loosely. But yeah, and then as we're kind of working on the next round of features, one of the things we are working on is something that we call Sermon Copilot, which is, and I'm going to say this very carefully, an ethical AI augmented sermon writing tool. We've taken a long time to like really even start talking about it, but we're working with a whole bunch of really well respected professors of preaching and pastors who are helping us build this in a way that truly is ethical. I don't personally think we should just go to ChatGPT and be like, hey, write me a sermon about Ephesians 5 and just preach whatever it puts out. But I do think that we can take frameworks that we're already probably using in some way, shape, or form, translate them into questions, and have the pastor answer those questions about the text. So they're still doing the exegesis work. We're providing them integrated tools that help them really, you know, really do an even better job potentially of getting to the heart of what this text is actually saying and what it means, and then applying it to our lives. And then we can do all kinds of really fun stuff with AI to help take everything that they've written, synthesize it, make it flow well, give them illustration help, that type of thing. So, and even when we describe that, people are like, "Oh, that sounds pretty cool." We've stayed away from a lot of the chatbot stuff, and so I think we've avoided a lot of the. Because of that, I think we've avoided a lot of the ethical conversation where people would truly be like, "I disagree with how you're doing this." But yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sure
Yeah. It's
Bill
interesting
might
that it sounds like,
and be like, "No, I disagree with what you're doing." So, yeah.
yeah, it sounds like what matters to you is where the information is coming from primarily. So the information in your discussion guides, in your social content is not coming from the knowledge base of the model, but it's coming from the sermon that's provided, and your tool is working with that information rather than generating its own ideas. And then in the sermon writing context, you said the pastor is doing the exegesis, and the model is helping with kind of a workflow and brainstorm and summarization side of
Yeah.
things.
Yep.
Uh, yeah, that's interesting. So you use the word ethical several times, which excites me. If you had to summarize, what do you think ethical use of AI looks like? Maybe somebody's sitting down to kind of write out an AI policy. What are some of the things that you would just point to first? What are some bullet points of these are things that we've noticed, decisions we've made, considerations that are in our minds as we're evaluating features that we could introduce? Like, what are kind of the guidelines, the guardrails that are guiding your decision-making process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think your site actually does a really good job of kind of saying, okay, here are the kind of four pillars that we really need to be leaning on and aware of. For me, the first piece of it really is like transparency of the church saying, hey, these are the tools that we're using, and here's how we're using them. Um, if you have an inclination to hide that, then I think there's probably some level of conviction of the Holy Spirit in you that's saying like maybe this isn't actually an ethical use case. So part
Yeah.
of like the whole sermon copilot thing, like when we first started talking about this in 2022, we were like, if we ever build something like that, we want it to be something that pastors are totally unashamed to be like, we use Sermon Copilot, or we didn't have a name for it back then, but um, and I think that that's really kind of the first place to start is like, if you have any inclination to really be hiding any aspect of how you're using AI tools, then there's something wrong there.
Yeah, you're getting into Youth Pastor 101. Like, how far is too
Yeah,
far? Well,
exactly. Exactly.
you feel
Where's
like you need to hide
the
it, because if you need to hide it, it's probably wrong.
100%. Yep. No doubt. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that, and then just from a practical, like I'm a pragmatist when it comes to pretty much everything, honestly. And so I really think that that another piece of the ethics of it really needs to be like, okay, what direction is this taking us in? Like, is this taking us in a direction that leads to less human interaction or more human interaction? I
Mm.
do not think the church should be leading its people and, frankly, our culture in a direction that is less human. I think it should be leading in a more human direction. So, how are we going to take any kind of tool that we use on our website to help people find what does this church think about this? And it takes them to a sermon clip or something like that, to foster a more human conversation. And I think there's a ton of like really, really great opportunity in that of like, how can we connect you with a real person? There's tons of benefit for us to be able to create anonymous conversations, but at some point, Jesus is going to push that person to have a human conversation. Like, if we look at, like, Jesus was good with a crowd, but he always pushed them to the point of like real relationship with him at some point. And I think that that's sort of a principle that needs to be baked into the way a church is thinking about how are we using this tool. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, that's great. So I'm sure as you're testing, different features, you're evaluating a lot of content that's generated. And usually when you feed something into a model, you ask it to summarize or extrapolate from that. What you get is often a mix of information it's adding from its memory, information that's coming from the source text. Sometimes you'll see new ideas, sometimes you'll see a reduction of what was there, and you're like, well, why did you remove the heart of it? Like you'll get different results. I'm sure you're constantly evaluating, constantly putting in, material and seeing what comes out the other end with different techniques that you're trying out and solutions you're building on the back end. What are some ways that you evaluate content that's generated? Like, how do you kind of look at your tests and say, is this ready to go out to the user?
Yeah. Well, I'll say the first thing that we do is we just tell everybody that's using our platform, like, hey, everything we make is 90% done. That's our goal. Like, we're trying to get it to a point where it's 90% done, but you are the final filter. Like, we can tell you with a lot of certainty that this is not going to produce any kind of answer that is going to, lead your people to Satanism or something like that, right? Like, that's not where it's going to go. It's just not. Like, we've done a good job on that front. However, your specific theological ilk is, like, there's so much nuance in the church, right? Like, there's so many denominations, and every church has its own, whether written version of that, systematic theology or not, it's still an articulated version of their systematic theology. And so, we always just say, hey, you are the final filter. You need to read this. This is not a generate and then post. And then, the things that we do is we just try to test it from every different angle. If the tool has a specific, so we go to, like, with the discipleship content, right? So it's pulling in a sermon that's dealing with a text. One of the first things we did was we went out and found, like, the most controversial sermons that we could find to run through there and go, okay, like, how is this going to speak to, every major question that might be asked. And, I don't even probably need to write a list right now. You fill in the gaps, everybody has them, right? And so we just said, okay, how's it going to answer? And then how do we help this, make sure that it's going to frame it in a way that is true to what was said in the sermon and to the text. Ultimately, everything that we build in terms of discipleship content is always angled towards what's being said about the text and not what is just said by the pastor.
So have you seen the quality of content that's being generated change over the last 12 months? Like, as models change, as things develop, has quality changed? Is it getting easier to generate good content? And how do you think that'll evolve over time?
Yeah, I think it is getting easier to generate good content. So we do use OpenAI tools. We use ChatGPT-4. It's like one of the foundational tools for writing a lot of our discipleship, like the questions and summarization, that type of thing. We have other tools baked into it and a lot of prompt engineering that goes around how those are actually created. But I do think that it has gotten better at really distilling. So one of the things that we really focus on is training it to the main points of the sermon, and how are we actually, like, getting at what's being preached here in a way that, I think what you would want in any kind of small group conversation, right? Like, if the pastor is talking about, I don't know, like, how to love our neighbors well, but all the questions are centered around something like, one aspect of that, like understanding that you're loved by God and allowing God's love to flow through you. And that's the only thing that it does, because it's trained on, a whole bunch of data that says, oh, like, self-care is really important and that type of thing, which it is. I'm not downplaying that. But if it doesn't get to the other aspects of like, how are we actually going beyond ourselves and, doing what Jesus said is, the next part of loving God, which is loving our neighbor as ourselves. Right. And, then, it's not doing its job. And I do think that it has gotten better at saying, here are the main points that are really being emphasized, and how do we actually like delineate between those and ask really excellent questions. That's become easier for us. It's also probably a little bit that we've just been doing it more, and we're better and better at engineering the outcomes that we want. So yeah, but I mean, the tools are becoming far more powerful. We're baking in all kinds of other assistants and stuff like that are specifically designed to check theology and that type of thing. I'm really excited about the Church for AI guys, like what they're building and everything, and some of the other tools that are coming out on that front, and being able to implement those tools into our product. I think that the jam up on that is going to eventually be the denominational fraction, just how fractured the church actually is on theology. But I also think, one of the things we're getting ready to roll out is allowing a church to train their own model. So you can upload 25 to 100 sermons, and we will actually have a fine-tuned model that is specific to your church's, last 2 years of preaching, let's say. And that, I think, will also enhance our ability to have all the content generated sound very much like the specific church.
One thing that you said in there that caught my attention is that you're building assistants into the system that are checking theology and things like that. Do you feel a little bit like you're just herding interns? Like you have these digital interns that are okay but not very good at their job and don't have a ton of context, and you're just kind of figuring out how to plug them into each other to check each other's work?
Yeah, a little bit. Yes, absolutely. And then you have to figure out like, okay, in order, like, do we start here? Do we start here? Like, which one goes first? That sort of thing, because, it has the potential to change the content in between. And then, yes, 100%. And we're trying to figure that out systemically to say, what's the best order? How do we want to do this? And also, rather than just changing the content, how do we have it highlight? Here's what which is kind of going to be the first testing version of this, is where it'll produce content. The assistants will come in and do their thing, but it'll just basically be like, here's how I would have changed it. And you'll be able to see. So that's like, and then the beautiful thing about having a larger customer base at this point is like, we have a ton of people who have said, if you're testing anything, we are game. Like, just let us know. And so we're already working with a bunch of churches on that front. And it's nice to be able to say, hey, you tell us what you think about this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how it's similar to like the early days of the internet. The internet in the early 2000s was horrible, but compared to now, but it was amazing because it was better than anything that existed before.
Yeah. Yep.
And we were all so forgiving, copy and pasting HTML and waiting days for downloads to finish and things like that. But that's kind of what it feels like, in that everybody who is clued into AI at this point kind of knows I'm not going to get perfect results, and it's going to be a little bit painful, but I'm willing to try because it's better than what I've had access to in the past, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So across the org chart.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Across the org chart, from comms teams to creative arts to pastors and sermon writers, do you think there's a ceiling on how involved AI will get in the workflow, or do you think that it's just way too early for us to even know where the limits are?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably too early to know where the actual limits are. I think so. I was talking to the pastor of a church this past week at a conference, who is like a multi-site church. Like, I haven't asked permission, so I won't tell you who it is, but like, you've heard of this church before. And he was like, I envision AI as like literally a member of every one of our meetings. And he was like, I'm literally telling our staff that we need to be thinking about this as a member of every single one of our meetings. Not going to make decisions, but somebody that is there to like enhance everything we do. I do think that there's I think there's a ton of room and space for AI in the church, specifically because, I mean, this is just my kind of soapbox or whatever, and I'll stay off of it for more than a few seconds. But if the American church, at least, our culture is so fractured and so far from one another and so good at hating on one another and so trained to do that by social media, and, just media in general.
Yeah.
I honestly think that the opportunity that AI gives us in the church is to learn to love one another, both because it can point out the ways in which we are not being Christ-like in the way that we interact with others, and also because we can spend more time face to face with people. And ultimately, I forget who said it, but it's hard to hate up close, right? And if we could actually, as pastors and staff members, get close to even just our people again, I think it would make a world of difference. And so, yeah, I think there's a ton of space for AI to make a big difference.
Yeah, that's a mission that's easy to get behind. Yeah, we had somebody I used to work with who would always say, you can either spend the week uh, in the office writing a sermon, or you can go out and spend it with people and let the sermon write itself. And you're almost augmenting a reality where that's true, and it really does write itself because you have these tools that speed up the actual writing and assembly process of the stories and things that you're living out.
Yeah.
But I think that's really insightful, that conversation you had with the pastor that you mentioned, because if you start to think about AI as a member of your team, it gives you a little bit of a framework for how you might create guidelines and expectations around the AI, because there are certain team members who aren't going to make decisions that influence the organization as a whole or even individuals, but are there to perform specific tasks. And then you're going to have other members of your team who are going to be making decisions that impact outcomes. And if you start to think about it in that kind of org chart sense, in that job description sense, that's a pretty useful way to think about AI.
Yeah. Yeah. I was like, that's brilliant. I love the way you're talking about it. And I love the way you're pointing your staff to it and saying hey, we need to know about this. It's just a tool, and the way it gets used is up to us, and the church has an opportunity to take technology and say are we gonna be afraid of this and call it the devil, or are we going to say this is another way that we can show the world that we have the wisdom of the Holy Spirit on our side and discernment to be able to actually make great decisions that enhance the entire planet, whether you're a Christian or not. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an important aspect of all of this, is that it's not just something that the church is latching onto. It's something that's going to affect everybody.
Yeah.
And so we need to do it well, just like any other piece of technology or change in culture, any of that. So to close us out here, there's a lot of resources, I think, for people who are just getting started and who don't know a lot about AI and that kind of thing. But as somebody who, has been in the trenches building on this technology, looking forward at what's coming and thinking through all the different combinations of ways that you can put these tools together to get different outcomes. From your unique perspective, having kind of gone through that process, what excites you? What are you looking forward to? What are the things that you think might be most significant to look into? Maybe if somebody is kind of at the intermediate level and they're looking for the next technology to dig into, or the next idea to kind of sit down and whiteboard, how could this impact my workflow? What are the things that you would point to just say, man, this is what's exciting, and this is what our team's buzzing about right now?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard for me to narrow it down to one thing, honestly. Honestly, the word that everybody seems to be using a lot lately, that you've used a couple times, Mike, is workflow. And I do think that when we think about the efficiencies of the tools that we have, I don't know, Google Workspace, maybe your church is on Office, or Microsoft tools, whatever, Slack, all of that stuff is very much dependent on human interaction, in real time for it to create efficiency. So Slack reduces the number of emails you have to send. There's another person on the end of that. Like this, like AI gives us the opportunity to create in so much more creative ways, and enhance like every person's individual creativity in some insane ways. Like I'm a very auditory processor. Like I would 10 times rather talk than write. And I mean, I literally use AI to dictate and interactively modify content now. Like everything that I write almost is being written like with the assistance of AI out loud. And then and I think there are a lot more people that like will benefit from that kind of interaction. Like we created a tool that you can talk to it and it will create your content calendar for your social media, including image generation. And the image generation is not ready for production level, but every other piece of it, you could be driving to work in the morning and have your next 30 days of social media posts completely written by the time you get there. Like,
Wow.
And it'll ask you questions about like, well, what about this? And what is your like, and you'll be able to like literally like answer questions, and it will intelligently update your social media calendar, schedule those posts. You need to put eyes on everything we do, whatever. But that's the kind of thing that I think is going to really, really change the game for people. I do think that we're going to spend probably the same amount of time on screens from a like communication with other humans perspective. I think it's going to reduce the amount of time we spend on screens outside of that substantially. Like in the next 2 years, I think we're going to go to almost a Star Trek level of interaction with computers. Like we're going to talk to them, and that's going to be like, unless we need to see an image, and then we'll pull out our phone. But otherwise, I don't know what kind of hardware this is going to end up looking like, but I think you're going to have your AirPod in, and you're going to have an AI assistant, and you're going to talk. And if you need to see something, you pull your phone out and look. And I think that the opportunity of that is massive. I also think there's insane potential for how we actually pastor and shepherd people. Like, just a real tangible example. Like as a pastor, you tend to get a lot of emails that are angry, and I grew up at Southeast Christian Church where you're at, and
Yeah.
We answered every one of those, and I was always blown away by the fact that like voicemails that were angry, emails that were angry, were always spoken to. Like they were always addressed, and I was like, man, we're spending a ton of time on this. And to be honest with you, there was somebody in the office who had an incredible amount of empathy for every single person. And I would get so mad at the way in which people were like the story they were telling themselves about Bob or Dave or Kyle, and and what they said and their intent behind it and all of that. And Debbie Carper. I don't know if I'm like we might have to edit this, but Debbie had so much empathy for people, and she was like, Josh, you got to think about where people are coming from, and like the impact that she had on me and my pastoral ministry because of that, and how I interacted with people from then on was massive. And I think everybody needs a Debbie Carper to be able to help them have empathy for their fellow human beings who are probably hurting and have, so I like those are like weird kind of disparate examples, but I do think that they, kind of point to, there's just some really, really incredible opportunities in this. And I think the church has got to like say, we're going to engage because we can shape how this is used in a better way.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's perfect. And I'm not editing that because I'll celebrate Debbie any day. Everybody needs a Debbie. I think what's interesting about that example though is you can automate a lot of like responses to emails that you get over and over and over and over.
Yep.
But you need a Debbie to shape how you are using that information, because at the end of the day, it might be a snippet or a summarization, but there are empathetic people who can then guide how those snippets and how those summaries are used, which is really valuable.
Exactly.
Well, thanks, Josh. How can people check out your product? How can they keep up with what you're working on?
Yeah, absolutely. You can just go to church.tech. That's our name and our and our URL, and follow us there. And yeah, if you have questions or want to connect with us, there's a chat bot on there. it has real people on the other end of it. And so my team and co-founders are the first people that you'll talk to, myself and Matt and Sarah. And so we'd love to connect. And yeah, absolutely.
Easy. Yeah, if you're listening to this, definitely check that out. I know I've benefited from it. There is social content that I have put out into the world that has been shaped by church.tech, and it's sped up a lot of tasks for me. So super excited to see where you guys are going and what's rolling out in the near future. Thanks so much, Josh.
Thanks, Mike.